Dr. Katie Witkiewitz to Penn State this year as our Bennett lecturer. Katie, I've known her for quite some time now. Been able to watch her career really grow. She's a Regents Professor of Psychology at the University of New Mexico, and she directs the Addictive Behaviors and Qualitative Research Lab and is affiliated with CASA, the Center for Alcoholism, Substance Abuse, and Addictions at University of New Mexico. Katie grew up in rural New York, received her bachelor's degree in psychology from the State University of New York at Potsdam. We have two graduates in funny coincidence. She then went on to receive her master's degree in clinical psychology from the University of Montana, and then her PhD in clinical psych with a minor in quantitative psych from the University of Washington in 2005, working with Alan Marlin. Katie's research has given really sharp focus to addictive behavior, relapse, and empirically supported treatments of addiction. These efforts have led to several empirical investigations on the mechanisms of successful addiction treatment outcomes, as well as the development of interventions to prevent addictive behavior relapse, including things like group-based relapse interventions and, importantly, mindfulness-based interventions as well. She really is a leading national expert on mechanisms of addictive behavior change. Katie's accolades for her research are far too much to mention in this brief introduction, but it's worth noting she's been honored with awards at all stages of her career. She's published nearly 200 peer-reviewed articles already in top journals, has presented over 50 invited lectures, and her work has been incredibly heavily supported by the NIH, multiple institutes at NIH. I do want to take a moment after having had dinner with her last night to comment on her unparalleled commitment to service to the field. It's something we can all only aspire to. I really don't know how she does it, but just as a snapshot, she recently served as president for the APA Division 50, the Society for Addiction Psychology, and she currently, this is all current, serves. She serves on one of the society's committees. She currently serves on two committees for RSA, Research Society on Alcoholism, the second conference society, and was elected to serve on the board of directors for the International Society for Biomedical Research in Alcoholism, and chairs that society's membership committee. So that's 3 academic societies she's deeply engaged with today. And in addition to serving on editorial boards at several journals, this is the most outstanding part, she's the field editor for the journal Alcoholism, Clinical and Experimental Research. I'm going to get this wrong, it's a moving target.
Yeah.
The statistical editor for Journal of Addiction Medicine, deputy editor for the Journal of Statistics of Studies on Alcohol and Drugs, and associate editor for Psych of Addictive Behaviors. These are top journals in our field. We're very fortunate to have her here, and I believe she's about to become the editor at one of the top journals in our field. Also, perhaps most impressively, she chairs the NIH Scientific Review Group, Addiction, Risks, and Mechanisms, ARM. So it's just outstanding the contributions she's made already to our field, and we all appreciate everything that you do. And I have a plaque I'll just...
Oh, wow.
A nice poster.
Oh my gosh.
Each time, so we'll ship this to you, but this is the one that you have all been kind of seeing around the hallways.
It's beautiful. She's really pretty.
And just a little plaque for you.
Oh, thank you.
Thanks, Katie. Thanks.
That is gorgeous.
So we're really excited to have you here. And
and that's a Nittany lion.
To say, oh yes, that's a Nittany lion.
Okay, great. Excellent. Thank you so much, Stephanie. Wow, that's loud. Let's see how if I can do it without it. Is this okay? People in the back? It's all right? Okay. Well, if I'm getting quieter as we go, just yell at me and I'll jump back to the mic. Or if my voice starts to go, I'll jump back to the mic. Thank you, Stephanie, so much for the invitation, and to the PRC for this amazing honor. It's really amazing. I thought maybe you had the wrong person when you sent me that email. I didn't quite. This is really amazing. So it's really great to be here. I was first on Penn State campus 20 years ago, interviewing for a graduate position in human development and family studies. And as I shared with Stephanie at dinner and Ashley at dinner last night, I grew up in very rural New York outside of Rochester, Sodus Bay. Anyone from Sodus Bay? Okay. See, it's that rural. And when I visited Penn State in State College, it just felt a little too urban for me. So I went to Montana instead for graduate school. Please come on in. There's more seats in the front. I promise not to spit on you or bite. Maybe. All right, so I'm going to talk about mindfulness-based interventions for addictions, and I had to come up with some sort of clever title. So making a better Band-Aid is the subtext, and you'll understand that more when we get into this. So I wanted to do some disclosures. This research was supported by National Institutes of Health as well as small grants from other universities where I've been, Washington State University, University of New Mexico. We do have a book on this, so you might be thinking, well, that's a conflict. I have a book on mindfulness, but all the proceeds of that book go to a GL and Marlatt Scholarship Fund. So I don't make anything off that book. And it's a great little book. It's teeny tiny, because I don't have time to write more than a teeny tiny book. And I have no other conflicts related to this work. Is my voice still okay? You sure? I'm looking at you guys. You're okay. All right. So relapse is a really perplexing problem. And it's not just addiction behavior relapse. I think many of us have tried to change a health behavior. Has anyone in here ever tried to change, maybe not a health behavior, a behavior? Okay, right? Maybe you've set a New Year's resolution. Maybe you're thinking already about the New Year's resolution that you're about to set, that you've set every year, or many years in a row. So it is hard to change behavior. It's really hard to change behavior. And it turns out that when you have an addictive behavior, that it's especially hard to change. And so back in 1971, before many of us were born, Hunt and colleagues, Hunt, Barnett, and Branch, published this landmark work at the time. It was shocking at the time because basically what it showed is that people came into treatment for heroin, alcohol, nicotine addiction, whatever it was. They came in for treatment and they got abstinent with treatment. Treatment worked. 100% of them are abstinent in treatment. And then by a year following treatment, fewer than 30% were continuously abstinent. And at the time, this was a big kind of hit to the treatment community, to the research community, that we really were not serving these folks. They were coming to treatments, our treatments were effective, but the effects were not sustained. And so I know you're thinking, well, that was 50 years ago almost. We've gotten way better at this. We have gotten way better at plotting. But these are data from more recent alcohol clinical trials that we have looked at in my lab, the combined study, which was published in 2006, and then MATCH and Relapse Replication Extension Project, which were done in the 90s. And basically what you see is for alcohol anyways, this very similar story. People come into treatment. They are mostly abstinent. Pointer doesn't work, that's fine. Mostly abstinent, and then have some return to drinking. So I became very interested in this and really interested in why this happens, how this happens, can we predict this, with the idea that if we could predict this, we could prevent it. Now, I'm not the first person to come into that question. In fact, Alan Marlatt, who I went to work with at the University of Washington, has had that question for a long time. So why is relapse so common? Well, Mark Twain is famously quoted as saying, giving up smoking is easy. I've done it hundreds of times. And then Alan actually said something that I thought was very prophetic in one article. It's like a side comment in an article, but it's one of those things that just stayed with me forever, which is quitting is not nearly as difficult as staying quit. And for those of you who've tried to change a behavior, maybe not checking Facebook on your phone or not looking at the news these days or whatever it might be that you've tried to change, might be able to identify with that idea that quitting is not nearly as difficult as staying quit. Okay, so we've become very interested in why this might be. And of course, we can't separate, right? This is the Prevention Research Center. We can't separate the person from the communities in which they live. So first of all, we have to think about an individual embedded in a family and peer social context, many of whom might be using substances, Maybe all of their family and peers use substances. So imagine quitting under those contexts. In that context would be pretty difficult. Everyone around you is using substances. They're also in a job or school environment where potentially their coworkers or co-students are using substances. And they're in a community, and maybe that community is impoverished. Maybe that community doesn't have a lot of treatment supports. Maybe that community is pretty rural and they don't have a place to go to get treatment and support for their recovery. So that the context here really matters. Social environment really matters. We also know that learning matters. And you know, I'm trained as a radical behaviorist. Our lab at the University of Washington, which Mark, I'm sure you visited a number of times. It's been demolished, by the way, which is really sad. But it was a house on campus that Kim and I grew up in, and Rob's been there. And there was a little wooden plaque outside that said Walden 3. So, of course, Skinner wrote Walden 2. But anyways, we were behaviorists. So behavior matters for this too. And basically, I use these little smiley and sad face martini glasses to portray the positive and negative reinforcement of addiction. That basically what people learn with addiction, with any other sort of health behavior, is that, for example, when you feel really bad, or you're experiencing a lot of pain, or you're really angry with yourself or angry with someone else, and you have a drink, and you've learned over time that you like drinking, and that drinking helps relieve pain and helps relieve negative mood, you will do that behavior again. And that's the tricky thing about addiction, is that it works in the moment. So when I'm feeling bad and I come to associate drinking with feeling good, I will drink and I will feel temporarily good. And that's very tricky. Same thing with positive reinforcement. Some people enjoy engaging in addictive behaviors. Some people enjoy drinking. They get some reward from it. So that behavior will be encouraged. And this becomes habitual and automatic. So this is very tricky to uncouple. Now, of course, the brain is involved with all of this. And I like to say, if behavior is happening, the brain is happening, right? Brain is on board when behavior is happening. And of course, the brain is involved in addiction in many ways: planning and judgment, decision-making, reward seeking, reward targeting, so having kind of attentional bias for alcohol and drug cues. That's all kind of cognition, that's all in the brain, or not all in the brain, but brain is heavily involved. And then of course, amygdala and emotion gets involved in this too. So then we also have genetic influences and epigenetic influences. And I was talking this morning with Bo about some of the complexities of genetics and studying epigenetics. But we know that we're about to hopefully conduct a study looking at DNA methylation in relapse. But so the tricky thing is that it's not just one of these things. It's all of these things. So this is a really tricky problem. So that's why it's so common, I would say. It's a tricky problem. So we proposed 15 years ago now. By the way, if there's any eager students, this model needs updating, really. So please go for it. We proposed, I did something really weird with Alan's encouragement, which was to actually kind of publish on a theory first and then spend years of my career collecting the supporting data. I think it's better to do it the other way around, maybe. But we proposed this model of how cognitive, behavioral, affective, biological, and social influences might impact relapse risk. And we proposed that basically that it was this kind of dynamical, complex system. In the moment, all of this baggage that people had, these distal risks, interacted with kind of proximal things in the environment that would predict relapse in the moment. So we proposed this, and I want to just blow up one piece of it, which is the piece of it that's really modifiable targets for treatments. And so when we look at what we can actually change, right, we can't change the baggage. If we go back, we can't change the background factors. We can't change that you grew up with a family that was using. We can't change a lot of things. But we can change some things. We can change cognitions. We can change environment. We can change social, not easily. I'm not saying these things flippantly, that we can change these things easily. But these are things that are potentially modifiable. We can change neurobiology potentially and physiology, and we can hopefully help people with their affective state. Okay, so most treatments, gold standard treatments, attempt to provide skills for increasing coping with these different factors. Okay, so provide coping skills for coping with environment, cognitive restructuring, for coping with negative affect, for coping with various social factors, drink refusal skills, how to engage a non-using peer recovery network, all these kinds of things. We can do all these things. We have medications available that can really help with neurobiology, affective state, or the physiological factors, affective state. And the idea is that we can then prevent relapse. Okay. So we have this model, we have treatments that are modestly effective in helping people prevent relapse, but it's still happening, and it's happening a lot. Now, I was in the lab of the great Alan Marlatt learning relapse prevention, and I was a young clinical psychology graduate student with my first cases. In my first case, a relapse prevention case, a woman with alcohol dependence who Alan supervised. And Alan didn't do a lot of supervision in our lab, so I was really lucky to have Alan, the developer of relapse prevention, supervising me in this case. And so we looked at all of her triggers, and we spent weeks in treatment identifying her triggers, providing coping skills that she would use in specific situations when she experienced those specific triggers. And so we did this over and over again. And she wasn't drinking, and she was doing great. And then she had an upcoming week where she knew it was going to be a tough week. She was hanging out with an old friend, and she knew it was going to be a hard week. She was going to want to drink. And so we had all sorts of plans for what she was going to do. Role-playing, everything, coping skills to deal with that friend. And she got fired from her job. That we did not see coming. And she relapsed. And I remember being just devastated. If I can't help her, and she never came back. She never came back to treatment. I knew she'd relapse. She told me on the phone, and she never came back in. I was devastated. And I knew from that moment that this treatment was never going to really be effective because life was going to get in the way again for other people. And life is hard, especially for people with addiction. A lot of people with addiction really have really difficult lives. They've really struggled in a lot of different ways, histories of trauma. Life has been hard, and life's going to be hard. So that brings us to our topic for today. Can mindfulness training actually help individuals cope with life? Not cope with specific triggers, but cope with life and prevent addictive behaviors relapse. Okay, so that was the idea. Now, it all started many, many years ago. This work started back in the 70s with a promising alcohol researcher on the right there, Alan Marlatt, who was an up-and-coming, Mark, did you know him then? Up-and-coming star alcohol researcher who developed the first bar lab, where he had the idea, pure behaviorist, I want to bring people into the lab and study them in a lab with alcohol. Now, I've actually recently learned it wasn't the very first bar lab, but it was like the best bar lab at the time. Look at that. It's a pretty cool looking little bar. Okay, so Alan's the up-and-coming alcohol researcher. Everyone loves what he's doing innovative work. And he developed high blood pressure. And a doctor he saw wanted to put him on medication. And he did not want to go on medication. He said, what else can I do? And the doctor said, well, there's this like hippie thing called transcendental meditation. You could try that. I'm improvising a lot here. Mark probably knows these details better, and we can ask him about them at the reception. But so Alan tried transcendental meditation. He was hooked. He loved it. And he said, maybe this could be helpful for people with alcohol problems. So in 1977, he did one of the first controlled trials of transcendental meditation for alcohol use, and it was actually effective. But he was an up-and-coming researcher at an R1 institution. I imagine some of his colleagues were not thrilled with him doing this hippy-dippy stuff, and he moved on. So flash forward 20-some years, and we now have a new opportunity. And this was around the time I was coming into the lab. And what happened basically is there was a facility in Seattle, outside of Seattle, called the North Rehabilitation Facility. It was a minimal security prison, non-violent offenders, mostly drug offenders, drug and prostitution, petty theft, but not violent offenders. And one of the providers there wanted to do a Vipassana meditation retreat at the facility as part of the rehabilitation program. And so they put this into place, and they contacted Alan to say, we're doing this, could you study it? And Alan jumped at that opportunity. Of course, I would love to study meditation again. This sounds great. So sure enough, we wrote a grant to NIAAA. As far as we know, this was the first NIH-funded study of a mindfulness-based program for addiction anyways. And we were really interested in the effects of Vipassana meditation in this facility on alcohol use and as well as recidivism. Okay. Now, here's the basic issue. We could not randomize people to a 10-day Vipassana retreat. Our IRB would not let us do that. So what we did was recruited people who voluntarily took the course, and we recruited people who were at the facility at the same time who did not take the course. Now, of course, tons of biases there. It's not a randomized trial. We get it. Fortunately, the participants in the course did not differ from everyone else on any of the baseline characteristics, so that was good news. 57 completed the course over the course of the study, 116 did not, and you can see the demographics there. How many of you have done a Vipassana retreat, a 10-day Vipassana retreat? Just a couple. Okay. So Vipassana retreats are very traditional meditation retreats, 10 days in silence, waking at 4 a.m. and going to bed at 9:30 p.m., and from 4 a.m. to 9:30 p.m. you meditate for 10 days. And there's a talk from the teacher, Goenka, S.N. Goenka, who's passed away, but there's video recordings of him. So there's a talk in the evening. But it's basically 10 days of intensive silent meditation. And that's what they did. Here's some pictures from one of the men's courses. Now, what was so amazingly beautiful about this study is not only that it happened at all, which I think is also beautiful, that this facility decided to try to do this. But while we were running the study, there was also a documentary film crew making a film about the people going through the course. So this will probably be the only time in my life when my research participants are actually in a documentary film. I don't know if the people they exactly show were in our study, of course, because we don't, it's de-identified. But basically, there's a film about the people we studied. So I have a short clip. You can watch the whole movie actually on YouTube. It's called Changing from Inside. This store used to carry the DVD, but they're out of it. So the only way to get it now is through YouTube. But this is the director of security at this facility who was not excited at all about this. So the little clip I have here is going to show us some of the women who went through the course and some of the staff. This was done in the late 90s, so keep that in mind in looking at the hair.
Very open and also not bothered by the rules. The rules were okay. Everything was just, and I don't mean they were all tranquil. I don't mean that. They weren't necessarily tranquil. They were just okay with stuff. The security staff was here for a reason. The rules were here for a reason. That was what made me see that there was some real change there. Because some of these people were behavior problems before they went into meditation. They weren't when they came out.
Almost to a man, there was something behind their eyes that you couldn't get in. It was like this curtain hanging. And then when the course was over, you could see inside. them for the rest of their lives, but in 10 days, you could see inside, and they were there. You could see that they were there, whereas before they weren't there. You couldn't see them. And I really think that the women will be able to do that too, particularly when we got going through the course this time. I think that to be able to see them is going to be really marvelous.
There was a wager among some security staff over how many would actually complete the course. No one bet on all 7. But on the 10th day, when course participants can break their silence, 7 women residents emerged, successful. Yet despite all appearances, these were not the same women that started the course a week and a half earlier. There was something perceptibly different about them. Maybe it was that you could see them now, and they could see themselves.
I love myself today. I do.
Kind of an unusual feeling.
It's a wonderful feeling. And these tears are really tears of happiness, because the woman that I was in battle with all my life. And I've learned to love her today. And it feels wonderful. And the passion I feel for me. And I was really kind of fearful. But the things that came up for me were not the things that I was fearing would come up. Or maybe because of the technique involved, I was able just to really handle it, you know. And it was things that I've been running for all my life. And it was just right there in my face, and I had to look at it, observe, you know, and let it go. And I've been able to do that. And it really, I mean, there's such a peace and such a weight lifted. I can't tell you.
So that's the qualitative data. And here are the outcomes, which we've published years ago now. But basically, we found that after release, women and men who went through this Vipassana course had much lower hostility, much lower depression, anxiety, and much lower substance use. And the facility tracked them, and they had much lower rates of recidivism. So we were thrilled. And then we tried getting more funding. And this was in the 2000s. This was before meditation was on Time magazine. This was when meditation was not a household term. And so we tried and we tried and we tried to get funding to do a randomized clinical trial of Vipassana meditation. And every single time the reviews came back, well, that's promising preliminary data, but what is this Vipassana? What? The Dharma talk? What? What is this? So we were really getting quite discouraged at this point. I mean, I think we'd submitted the grant about 5 times. You know, you had to go bounce between institutes back then and change things. And so we were really getting exhausted with this. And we didn't really know what to do, and we were going to give it up, honestly. But Alan would not let us do that. Thank goodness. And we took a page from very smart people, John Kabat-Zinn and Zindel Siegel. And we said, hey, wait a minute. So mindfulness-based stress reduction, mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, they secularize this. They don't say the word Vipassana. They don't say Dharma talk. They don't say Sangha. They secularize everything and manualize it. Could we do that? And wait a minute. Oh, we've got this thing called relapse prevention here that our lab developed. Well, why don't we call it mindfulness-based relapse prevention? And sure enough, it funded the first time. So Sarah Bowen and Neha Chawla, graduate students at the time with me, and Alan wrote the clinician's guide. It's a manualized treatment. It's 8 sessions. It's very similar to mindfulness-based stress reduction and mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, although slightly more geared towards addiction, addictive behaviors, reactivity, craving. There's, again, 8 sessions. It's group-based, 2-hour sessions, 2.5 to 2 hour, depending on the setting. We do formal mindfulness practices, meditation practices, as well as the informal practices that I'll talk about. These are the different sessions, and really it's about using mindfulness practice to really come into your daily life and be able to be in your life and tolerate your life and use these practices to sit with distress. Really, that's what it's about. I actually, if I had to situate it within the existing behavioral therapies, I would situate it within exposure and response prevention more than anything. Because what we do is we practice mindfulness, which is hard. It causes some distress because you want to put your mind on your breath, but then your mind wanders. For anyone who's ever practiced mindfulness at all, you might identify with this mind wandering thing that happens. It's okay, that's what our mind does. And so we just observe non-judgmentally the wandering, and we bring ourselves back to the present moment and just do this. If our mind wanders 100 times, we bring our attention back 100 times. Every time our mind wanders and we catch it, it's a little gift, because that right there is a moment of mindfulness, when we observe our mind wandering. So we brought this into, in this idea of practicing mindfulness, we wanted people to practice mindfulness, to do the practices, but we really wanted something, a tool they could use in their daily life. And so Sarah Bowen came up with this brilliant acronym of SOBER. And this was really based similar to the hourglass breathing space of MBCT, which is why I have the hourglass there. But the idea with SOBER is to just give people a little break. Whatever situation they're in, I use this, by the way, in TSA security line. Like, it works like a charm. I travel a lot. I used it on the way here. Like, it's tremendously helpful. Grocery line, when someone's slow in front of you and they've got tons of groceries and you just really want to pay and go. Have you experienced that little bit? Traffic, East Coast driver here, West Coast drivers, especially New Mexico is pretty slow. So yeah, sober a lot. Okay, so it just stands for stop. Stop whatever you're doing. Stop whatever mental chaos you're in, and observe. Come into the body. And then breathe. Focus on your breath. Take as many breaths as you need. Maybe take a deep breath. Expand back out and respond mindfully. So that's it. It's a very brief practice. 98% of the people who go through our trials say they use this the most frequently, and that it helps them prevent relapse. It gives a small pause to otherwise triggering situations. So we do this in the sessions, and we do this, we do imaginal exposure. So we have people bring to mind a very stressful situation, and then we have them practice this. We also do urge surfing. Of course, urge surfing was part of Alan's 1985 relapse prevention book. We've done some tweaks, but the idea with urge surfing is you can stop the waves. You can't stop the waves, but you can learn to surf. So what we have people do is we have them, again, in session, imagine something very stressful, some urge, some situation that is triggering for them, and then we have them sit with and ride out that experience and stay with the distress. And over time, that craving comes down. That's not the goal, but that's what people report. So if I really had to summarize it, I would simplify that crazy model with all the circles and things. And I would say that what happens with relapse is basically there's some sort of trigger, and I call it trigger, but it could be interpersonal, it could be depression, anxiety, a situation you're in, whatever. Something happens. Life happens. And then you ruminate on it. And something else happens and you get reactive, and all of a sudden you're using a substance. So what mindfulness does, the core of it, is basically to say, yep, that trigger is going to happen. We're not getting people out of triggers. Life is hard. But we're going to hold that trigger in our awareness. And we're going to do so without judgment towards ourselves, towards the trigger. That's it. And we're just practicing that over and over again. Holding triggers in our awareness, being present with them. Can we stay with them? We also do one other thing, which is we encourage staying with discomfort, but we also encourage staying with and being with things that are pleasant. Things that bring us joy and peace. So I don't know about you, but my first sip of coffee in the morning, especially a beautiful latte like that, like when I show up for that moment, it's awesome. I don't always show up for it, but when I do, it's so great. And gosh, how many moments have I missed when I could have just shown up? I just lost my dog, but if you have a dog and you walk a dog, walking a dog, man, when you really show up for it, it's so cool. They're happy, they're smelling things. You're getting exercise when it's not freezing cold. Awesome. So really showing up and embracing those things and being aware for them too. That's what this is about. So, is it feasible? That was our first question. Well, we've now done 3 randomized clinical trials. They're all published. The references are there. We've primarily worked with very severe end of folks. We've primarily worked in community treatment agencies where folks have primarily alcohol or polysubstance use disorders, a mix of comorbid mental health conditions. Our first study, this first effectiveness study, about 30% of participants were unstably housed. So we were wondering, I mean, really? They're like living under the I-5 bridge? Are they going to meditate? Like, and the reviewers wondered that too. The grant reviewers, they still gave us the money, but they wondered that too. In this second study that I ran at a women's residential treatment facility for female criminal offenders, 70% of them had severe comorbid anxiety, depression, or PTSD, and sometimes all of the above. 46% had prior suicide attempts. It's a very severe group of folks. And then our biggest efficacy trial, we had 82% with polysubstance use disorder. So we've tested this in the community in hard-to-reach populations, is my point. And in both our effectiveness trial and efficacy trial, which I show here, we found as far as engaging in mindfulness practice, we get more than half to almost 3/4 of the sample who are engaging in mindfulness practice. So they're doing it. It's feasible to do. We recruit people, they do it, they engage in the practices. And that's good news. It seems that people can do this and they can maintain. So the 12-month follow-up was 12 months after treatment. About 72% of them were still practicing mindfulness, at least some mindfulness. And then does it work? That's our second big question. It does, actually. Our pre to post effect sizes, which I have there, are medium to large or quite large for just within the MBRP group. And then when we look between treatments, other active treatments, we see small to medium effect sizes, but statistically significant better effects in the mindfulness-based relapse prevention group, particularly as the follow-up was longer in the efficacy trial. But is it clinically meaningful? And the answer is yes. So if we look at kind of rates of any drug use or any alcohol use, we're cutting those rates in half with mindfulness-based relapse prevention versus gold standard relapse prevention. And as far as any drug use in my effectiveness trial, we see more than half. And this trial was really notable to me. These are women in the criminal justice system. If they have any use, there are dire consequences for them. They're on probation, they are getting urine tests. So we didn't have a ton of use. In fact, out of all the women that were followed, only 6 used, but 5 of those 6 were in relapse prevention. And they had a lot of drug use. That's each of their use days. So looking at individual women in this study, 8 days of methamphetamine and cannabis, 5 days of methamphetamine, frequent use, just I stopped counting of opioids, cocaine, methamphetamines, cannabis, and hallucinogens. And in the MBRP group, we found 1 person who used 1 day of prescription opioids. So that is hugely clinically meaningful. In fact, this treatment center where we were working was delivering both relapse prevention and mindfulness-based relapse prevention at the time, and now they're a completely mindfulness center for women. So this is all good. Why is this effective? What are we training in the brain? That's a new question we're interested in, and I'm not going to get into this too much. We have some papers on it now, but if we go back to this figure of this kind of massive neural dysfunction that occurs with addiction, we think that basically what's happening is with mindfulness-based treatment, we're decreasing the bottom-up reactivity, and we have some data to support that now with EEG, and that we might actually also increase top-down control. So again, so that trigger can still happen, but the brain gets less engaged with it. That there's some sort of break between the trigger and the engagement at the neural level. Okay, so this looks great, right? Things are going well for us. But we got to come to the Band-Aid, and here it is. So we had the amazing opportunity as part of a Mind and Life Institute to present to His Holiness the Dalai Lama in Dharamsala. Sarah Bowen was invited to present, and I got to be her academic spouse and attend too. So we went to Dharamsala, India, and we're presenting our work as part of a conference on craving and addiction to the Dalai Lama. We're very excited for this opportunity. Here's a picture of Sarah and Richie Davidson dialoguing with His Holiness. And basically, he said we were doing great work, totally fine, and it was just a Band-Aid. That basically we should be doing prevention. These people are already too long gone, these people we had worked with. It was all over for them. That this is just a Band-Aid. Well, I was pissed. at His Holiness the Dalai Lama. Which was really hard to reconcile for me as a practicing Buddhist. And man, did I spin on that. And here I am again. I really spun out on that a little bit. I mean, really, I went between what does he know? It's a lot. And what am I doing with my career? I went towards okay, His Holiness the Dalai Lama knows a lot. I should look at my career. And I specifically wanted to see if we can make a better Band-Aid. I thought, Band-Aids have good purposes. And there's really junk Band-Aids, and then there's really good Band-Aids. And maybe we could make a better Band-Aid, and maybe that would be okay. Maybe that would be good. Band-Aids have healing properties. So the first thing I've thought a lot about recently is we've done this in clinical trials and select programs, but we really need to be thinking about dissemination and implementation. And the second thing I've really thought about is a precision medicine approach. We see a little bit higher dropout rates from our groups than standard groups. Who would benefit most from this intervention? And could we get that to them sooner rather than later? So I'll talk just briefly about some of our dissemination work. The first step in dissemination implementation science is needs assessment. What do community treatment programs need? What can they actually do? What kind of adaptations do we need to do to make this accessible to community treatment? And the first thing they said is we cannot do 2.5-hour, 8-week groups that are closed. We need open enrollment, rolling groups, and they can be about an hour. So fortunately, I had a very talented graduate student who wanted to take that on as his dissertation, and he developed an open trial, rolling admission, mindfulness-based treatment that we have now disseminated throughout the Albuquerque metro area. We're now in 5 different treatment programs in Albuquerque. Anytime I give a training, I disseminate that manual, this rolling group manual, for free. Anyone here want it, happy to give it to you. We get it into as many places as we can. So we're doing that. The next thing we're doing is we do want to focus on prevention, and that's what His Holiness was getting at, was prevention. And so we're working with veterans right now with chronic pain and opioid misuse. They don't meet full criteria for opioid use disorder, but they're trending in that direction, and so we've worked on adapting this for them. We also just started a really interesting study with police. Policing is a very high-stress job, especially in today's climate. The Albuquerque police are particularly shooty, and so they actually are under DOJ consent decree, and so we are working with Albuquerque Police, which is under consent decree for being having excessive use of force, and we're working with the Portland Police Department, where Sarah Bowen is, because they have also gone under DOJ consent decree, and seeing if we can help them handle the stress and be more resilient in their positions as police officers. Precision medicine, we have found in 2 trials now, we've replicated this effect that ethnic minorities have better outcomes in MBRP than standard treatment, much better effects than we would have expected. And this is a fun new finding that we have to replicate yet, but we have found that both men and women benefit from receiving MBRP in groups with more women. So when more women are around, everyone benefits. is what we conclude from this study. I'll leave it there. All right, our last bit of finding, and this is also really important, we found early on that MBRP might be especially effective for people who are more severe. So we conducted an initial study, found people with higher depression had better outcomes in MBRP, and we've just replicated that in the RL1 study, showing people with more comorbid negative affect symptomatology seem to have better outcomes in MBRP. So that's good. What are we doing next? You know, to get funding these days, it's great to put a brain in your grant application. And I say that kind of facetiously, but it is interesting to think about how this is working in the brain. So I love this quote from Viktor Frankl, between stimulus response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. I think the sober breathing space is so effective because it just gives a little bit of a pause and a little bit of a chance for these people who've been struggling their whole lives to make a choice that is a better choice for them in that moment. And I would love to understand that at the neural level and to see if that's actually happening. Of course, we want to go mobile. I had a great conversation with Saeed and Sabrina earlier about how do we do this? How do we do this work digitally? I don't know if we can do it, but we're gonna try some things. And then going back to His Holiness the Dalai Lama, I do think starting younger. I've spoken to a few of you about doing this in middle school, early high school. I had a client in a group who was in his late 70s, had destroyed his life from addiction, and he just said, "Where were you when I was 13?" And that really stayed with me. So if you're interested in learning more or bringing this into your life, you can do this anytime. You don't need special training. You just can show up for your dog walk or your cup of coffee. It's actually really brilliant. Washing the dishes is lovely when you do it mindfully. There's some references, and I have them at the end too, so you don't have to get them down now. I have to acknowledge the many people involved with this work, particularly my colleague Sarah Bowen and partner in crime in all of this work, and then my many grad students and undergrads over the years, but mostly this all is in memory of Alan, who was your 2009 Bennett lecturer. So a decade later, it's really an honor for me to honor his work by presenting where it's gone from that time. And Alan was a great force in many people's lives, including mine. So thank you all. Yeah, open for questions, far and wide. Yeah.
So the Dalai Lama's main argument was that that those people there didn't have their addictive behaviors, and that they were just, is he saying they're too far gone? Or?
Yeah, that basically we should focus our efforts on prevention.
I just don't see why you can't do both.
So, thank you. Yes, that was my frustration. And you know, as part of the Mind and Life, you have the dialogue with the Dalai Lama, but then afterwards you get to speak with the other monks who are there, and they very much did not hold that view, or they were very interested in hearing more about how they could bring this into their communities because they were, you know, around people who really would benefit from some of this work. So yeah, it was surprising. Yeah. Yeah, Rob.
Antidepressants work better with people who are not severe. So I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about why this approach works better with people who are having a harder time.
Well, so, you know, MBCT, mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, works better with people who are more severe. And so there might be something to mindfulness-based techniques for people who are more severe. I also think a lot of people who are more severe have been exposed to a lot of the same thing over and over again in treatment, and this is radically different. And so I think there is something to standard treatments had not helped them, and this is just a very different approach. I also think, you know, this gets at way more than just the addiction. And so we're really teaching people new ways of being in their world, of being in their skin, which is often distressing. And I think the standard community treatments are really focused on, you know, those specific skills training pieces and not so much the whole person and how they engage with their life per se and how they handle distress across situations. And so I think for all those reasons, it may be more effective. Jury's out. I don't know. Mark?
Katie, it's secularized in this particular way. But I think this work is also about people's sense of meaning and spirituality, irrespective of that. And when you say it goes deeper, what's your sense about that, about sort of the more spiritual aspects of this in terms of people have addictions about a lot of pain and suffering. And so we often talk about suffering as part of the process of needing and finding value of spirituality.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point, Mark. And you know, things that we do in this treatment, we do loving kindness meditation. We also do a forgiveness practice. We also do, I was just sharing a new practice we've developed called a values practice. It's really about just connecting with meaning in life. And I think a lot of treatments, I mean, AA does a really good job of doing that, but in a very Christian sense, which a lot of people don't like. This does it in a very secular, like finding your own meaning, your own purpose. So I do think there is something to that. And also another piece of this, and I think this is why that this treatment's more effective with ethnic minority groups actually, is potentially because we're not about telling people anything about their experience. What they experience is their experience. We're not the experts. And so I think there is this I mean, heal thyself sounds really cheesy, but really this deeper kind of way of interacting with yourself and with what you're experiencing that we haven't had in other standard treatments. The other piece is we depathologize addiction every chance we get. And I think that also helps engage with people at a deeper level, that they're not flawed individuals, like that they have come to find addictive behaviors as a way of coping with their life. And of course they do. Like basically really, we do actually a false refuge practice. For those of you familiar with Buddhism, we do a false refuge practice now where we actually talk about like, what are you trying to get out of alcohol and drugs? And people say connection, freedom, you know, no more pain, no more distress, to get away from my problems. Like those are all humble things. Like, of course you want all of that. It's not what you get, but of course that's what you want. And so I think there is a bit of this deeper spiritual piece that, yeah, we haven't touched much. Yes, and then over here.
So I'm curious about your thoughts on translating this into the mobile world, because a common critique of mobile devices is that we're too attached to them already, and it automating things, and it sounds like mindfulness is more about distancing yourself from that and really looking at it seems like that was like too much.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of tricky things with mobile, and that's one of them, right? Like, Blake and Rob were just telling me about their class and how like the students identified like mobile phone use as a habit they wanted to not have, right? And so I think that is tricky. It's more about, for me, if we could increase engagement with practices. So that's more of where we're using it as a way of like, it's in your, I mean, how many people have their phone with them, right? Like it's with you all the time, and like having practices on there as a way of increasing practice and engagement. I think it's going to be harder to develop an effective way of delivering this as a standalone thing. It's something we've been chewing on, but I think that is a trickier ask. Yeah, thank you. Here.
I was curious what you're looking at. Speaking of this whole idea of spirituality, do you know what happens aside from their use of mindfulness practices? Are they more likely to engage in AA? Are they more likely to engage in forms of spirituality in their communities? Do you measure any of that?
We do. And in fact, we have a paper on it that I can send to you that explicitly looked at that. And in the Vipassana trial, we explicitly looked at, like, did this change their religious practices? Because early on when we were doing this work, that was a concern from people, like, don't mess with my religion. And we have to like be really clear, like, no, this is secular, like you can keep being Christian or whatever you want to be. And the secret name of the paper that is not the title is, Does Vipassana F with Your Religion? That was the, they wouldn't, editorial board wouldn't let that go through. But we tried. No, we didn't. But no, what we found is actually it did not decrease people's spirituality. It actually increased people's spirituality with their own religion. It did not like make people Buddhist. It did not make people agnostic or atheist. It actually increased their religion, their religious connectedness or spirituality with their own religion. Yeah. Okay. Ooh, they're coming fast. There and then there. I'm trying to remember who asked last.
So it seems like another common treatment program like Alcoholism Anonymous, one of the big proponents of that is like the social connection, accountability from people, getting support from others. And this seems very like individually based, like you're not talking, you're not interacting with other people. So do you think that you should kind of have both, like both the internal, but then also, like, is there value in like meditating next to someone? Or
Yes. Oh, it's huge. It's actually the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. The Sangha is being with other people. So you noticed in the video clip, they were meditating alone but together, right? They weren't in their rooms by themselves. And we've always done this as a group. And there's so much value to people sharing their own experiences of the practices, because the same 5 things come up for everyone that have come up for thousands of years. They're called the hindrances, and they come up: restlessness, sleepiness, wanting, not wanting, and doubt. And they come up from everyone. So in a group setting, people are sharing that experience, and you can identify with it. We are currently running a trial of this for individual treatment, and so we will know more if the group is really important, because if the trial doesn't work as well, you know, it's not a head-to-head randomized, but we might start to think individual was not the way to go. Yeah. Okay, here.
Sorry. Might be missing something fundamental or rudimentary because I've never even taken a psych class, but if we're looking at prevention for, bringing this into juveniles, a lot of what we're talking about is self-awareness and looking at what's going on around you, which I would attribute to being self-actualization and Maslow's hierarchy. But if a lot of these kids are in communities where they're still working on their physiological safety, food, shelter, wondering if they're going to get beat when they go home, are they actually going to be capable of even attaining that level of self-awareness, or would there be something else at play here?
Yeah, no, I think it's really important. In our first study, we had 30% who were unstably housed, did not have those kind of basic needs met. And they were able to engage with the practices. We've done this work in juvenile justice and had good effects. We had to make a lot of adaptations, like shortening a lot of the practices, definitely not 2 hours, more like 50 minutes, and then each practice itself was shorter. I think as far as like enlightenment, that's a big ask for any of us. But as far as kind of helping people be okay with those really difficult situations that they're in, or at least cope differently without making their situation worse, I think we can help with that. I think we can. Yeah. Here and then here.
Great presentation.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, well done.
Thank you.
A real model of kind of a sustained research line.
Thanks.
I guess looking at some of the data presented, it looks like the confidence intervals could be pretty large. The effect sizes are not always large. Although I understand it's a high-risk sample, and it's not pointing to indication of clinical significance. There seemed to be some difference between the efficacy trial and the effectiveness trial in terms of sustained use. So, kind of situating what you're presenting here within kind of a larger context of a lot of talk about mindfulness. I wondered if you would just sort of point out, well, here's some things that I would caveat or some points of limitations in terms of how we might use these interventions for such a high-risk sample.
Yeah.
Will we couple this with other types of interventions, or is this sort of standalone type of treatment we should be using, and things that you just might sketch out as kind of things to keep in mind as we consider this research?
Definitely, yeah, no, great point. And those confidence intervals are huge. We have real bimodal outcomes, so lots of zeros, lots of people not using, and then some people who are using a lot. And so those confidence intervals reflect that kind of non-normality. So lots of limitations. The 3 trials that I talked about were all in the context of other treatment. And so this was really developed as an aftercare program, truly a relapse prevention program. So you have gone through treatment, you've achieved some abstinence, and now you're getting relapse prevention. So we recently completed a trial of harm reduction trial where we recruited people directly from the community, and our effect sizes were smaller. We're currently in our individual treatment study. It's the only treatment they're getting, and it's an outpatient trial. So we are doing that work now. I mean, I think a big caveat is that, you know, doing this work with fidelity, right? Like so far, the 3 trials I presented were done by us. Other groups have used this and have gotten similarly small effects, but I think the effects are small. I mean, I'm not going to say this is going to cure addiction, right? I think this works for certain groups really well. I think it works better than what a lot of people are getting, and that's why the dissemination piece is so important. And it hasn't been harmful. And there is work on like mindfulness groups being harmful, like causing psychosis and dissociation. We have not had any of that in 400 subjects, over 400 subjects run through. So I'm not so concerned about it being harmful. But whether it's way better than everything else, yeah. I think we have a lot to learn yet. Yeah. Can I get, I wanted to come over.
I think this is quick.
Okay.
Can you say who, and you may have just answered it, who was facilitating, and do you need to have a mindfulness practice yourself to facilitate, and or do you need to have some experience as a substance abuser to understand the people who you're facilitating?
Yeah, so definitely number one, yes. Yeah, it's a requirement. To do this work, you have to have a mindfulness practice, without a doubt. Not only because it makes you know what you're teaching, but also to be in the room when this level of distress is coming up. I mean, we're essentially exposing people with a lot of urges to their own urges, and it's hard in the room. So being with that level of distress, I think, really requires your own steadfast practice. So yes, we require practice. We don't require a history of addiction, but we do require that you've worked with treating addiction before. So those are the 2 requirements to facilitate. Yeah. Kim?
So I'm wondering if you looked at when people do have slips and if they, even if it was catastrophic, are able to come back.
Yeah. What we see when we look at like the individual patterning in the data, the people in the mindfulness condition, if they do have a slip, it tends to come, like they come back to center much quicker. Less guilt and shame and all of that. Yep. So they are, the relapses tend to be less severe in the mindfulness group, whereas in the other groups they tend to really fall off the wagon, quote unquote. Yeah.
Let's take this chance to thank you.
Oh, thank you.